Welcome to part 2 of preparing your race shell. Now, before I crack on from where we left off last time, I thought it might be worth answering a question I've had from the last video. And that is, what happens when your front of your shell, or the shell itself, hasn't been moulded nice and flat or has a nice flat base? How do you mark the line across the front of the shell? Well, here's a shell. This one's a Cat MG Lola, I think. It's been sitting in the cupboard for ages. It's probably a bit misshapen, etc. It's been trimmed at some stage or other. So it's also got a very slight twist in it from the rear wing to the front of the shell. And you can also see that the line that's along the front of the shell isn't very straight anyway, the mould line that's there. So that's not going to be any good for when we come to trim it out and how we get a nice flat edge at the front. So I'll quickly answer that question. And we're going to use the body jig again, which you'll see that in this video, and hopefully you've seen my other videos on body jigs. If you haven't, I'll put a link on the screen now. But I'm going to take the body shell. I've got a little bit of piano wire taped inside the rear wing. I've also set up the body jig with the rear wing external mount being equidistant either side. So basically it's horizontal compared to the base of the jig. It doesn't really matter about the height of it at this stage. I trim the sides of the body down a bit so that there's no mouldings on the sides, and I'm going to put it onto the jig and I'm going to make it sit down the slots in the jig. So it's sitting there. It's actually probably slightly lower than it's going to end up, but it doesn't matter. But the key thing is that the wing is set up parallel to the base plane on the jig. And then when the body sits there, the front of the body will sit down and it will just rest on the front of the jig. But you can see it's not very flat and straight. But it's going to sit on whatever bit it happens to be cut to. But the key thing is the body is being held by the rear wing. And the rear wing is parallel to the base plane. So now I can use the same technique as I used before. Taking my black pen, I'm going to just rest a straight edge or a flat edge on the front of the block, just so that when I'm running my pen along, I'm not going to run down into the hole in the middle. So then I'm going to take my pen, make sure it's going to write, and then I'm going to just push the pin tubes in slightly. Don't know whether you can see that in the video, but I pushed those tubes in. I've just pushed those tubes in slightly. It just helps hold the body in place and stops it from wobbling from side to side. There's no chassis in here, but because the body goes down into the slots, these will hold it in place and just stop it from moving when I draw the line across the front. So then I'm going to draw my line like so. There we go. And now you can see that I've actually got a nice straight line across the front of the body shell. You can see sort of that edge is totally different to that edge, but it's actually nice and parallel with the base of the jig and the rear wing. So when I trim that, I know my body shell is going to sit nicely. Thank you. Let's crack on with part 2. After we've trimmed the sides of the body shell, and before we paint it, I'm actually going to add some reinforcing to the body shell. I like to add some reinforcing sometimes before I paint it, because I think maybe sometimes it sticks to the body shell better, actually directly to the body shell rather than onto the paint. So I have some body armour here. Not too sure what brand it is, but basically it's LEXAN with a double-sided sticky on the back. This is cut to about 5mm width. So I'm going to remove my bit of panel wire from the back of the back body. Don't need that in there anymore. And obviously I've got my pinholes here. Now I'm going to reinforce on the inside of the body shell. If you wanted to reinforce on the outside, obviously you would have to peel the protective coating away, and you wouldn't. You could obviously spray it first anyway. But because I'm going to put the reinforcing on the inside of the shell, then I'm going to do it before I spray the body shell. So you can see that I've cut one end of my reinforcing at a slight angle, because I'm going to put my reinforcing right up inside the rear wing, right up to the top corner here. And it's going to go from the pinhole all the way up into that top corner. I'm not going to put it at too much of an angle, because if I put it right into the back corner, when I trim out for the wheel, I'll probably be trimming through the whole of the insulation. So I don't want the reinforcing. So I don't want to do that. So I want to maybe put it just at a slight angle, but enough so it's going to miss where I'm going to cut out for the wheel arch. So I'm going to mark that up there, line that up there, and I'm going to trim it off at the bottom of where I want it. It's not quite at the right angle at the top, so I'm just going to trim the top a little fraction. The good thing about doing this whilst it's clear is you can also see exactly where it's going to go on the shell. So I'm quite happy. It's about halfway on the back of this shell. But I would be doing the same if this was a saloon shell, if this was an open group 12 shell, I'd be doing exactly the same thing. So when I'm happy that the reinforcing is where I want it, where it's going to be, I can then just trim off the bottom. Like that. And then I've got a template for the other side. Now remember, when you're doing the other side, make sure you flip your reinforcing around so that you're cutting it at the right angles. So here I have my 2 bits of reinforcing trimmed, ready to go. Alternate sides of the body shell. I'm going to start by just flattening out where I've pinned the holes through my body shell. So I'm just going to use the end of my tweezers, or you can sometimes use the back of your nail just to flatten out the inside of the body shell. It'll help your reinforcing to stick better. And then I always give the inside of the body shell a bit of a wipe, because it might have fingerprints, etc. on it. So a bit of IPA or light fluid on the inside of the body shell on a rag. Make sure it's wiped clean where you're going to stick the reinforcing to. So I'll do the back bits first. Then just check that's going to go on that side of the shell. So I peel a little bit back. Don't peel it necessarily all the way off, but I fold it back like that. Then I can see exactly where it's going to go inside my body shell, get it lined up where I want it to be. Peel that back. There we go. Turn the shell over, and again maybe use my tweezers. They've got rounded ends, they're not sharp, and I'm going to push that down, make sure that's flattened nicely and stuck well onto the inside of the body shell, all the way down the edges like that, making a nice good contact with the body shell. And then we do the other side. And there we have it, the rear of the body shell reinforced. It is similar at the front, but I'm not going to do so much at the front. Again, I have another strip of reinforcing here. This one's cut slightly wider. This one's about 8mm wide. And I'm going to trim off a couple of pieces, maybe about 5mm high. So I end up with a sort of rectangular piece. I then just trim off the top 2 corners, just so I don't end up with sharp corners at the top, like that, off of one piece. Like that. And then these pieces are now ready to stick over my pinholes at the front of the body shell. apply them maybe with a pair of tweezers, helps you locate it better so you don't put your fingers onto the body shell. There we go, we've reinforced the front of the body shell. Sometimes you can get away with smaller squares. Maybe on a 30-second car you could get away with smaller squares, but you need a big enough area for the reinforcing to actually bond properly to the body shell. If you go for a tinier square, it doesn't actually stick itself very well to the body shell, and then you're not reinforcing the body shell so much then. There we go. Now that we've reinforced the pinholes on both sides, before we spray the body shell, there's a couple of things we still need to do. First thing, I'm actually going to recreate the holes in the side. So I'm going to get a pair of pliers. Now see why I'm going to use those in a minute, and a sharp point. Now I'm going to use these pliers just purely to support the reinforcing material as I push the spike through the holes, just so I don't push it off the inside of the body. So I can push that, put that underneath like that, just using the hole in the end of the pair of pliers. I can find the hole that was there originally, and I can poke through the hole. So I'm just remaking those holes again through the reinforcing. That's all 4 holes done. Also, I'm just going to put a little bit of masking on the body shell. I'm not bothered about necessarily how it's going to look, as long as it meets the rules. I know some of you will be really good at painting and have loads of ideas and loads of tips that maybe you could share with people about how to paint body shells, but that's not the point of this video. So in order to keep the body shell fairly light, I'm going to mask off some areas where I don't want to put any paint, and they are the lights at the front, like that. I don't really have the proper masks for this body shell, but they're very close to the markings on the shell itself. And the front wheel arches, where the wheels are going to be going onto the shell. They're going to be stickers, but again, it saves painting that part if I put a mask on. These are masks that I've used before. You can see they've already got paint on the back of them. And now that's ready for painting.
A few moments later.
We're back. Body is sprayed, so now it's time to remove the masking and finish the mounting process. After the masking is removed, it's now time to clean up the pinholes a little bit. Now in the previous parts we punched through the reinforcing with a sharp point. Now I'm going to use a small drill. This drill is about 0.8 of a millimetre, and I'm just going to use that to drill through and open up the holes slightly more. The reason behind this is I want the pins to be a fairly loose fit in the holes so that the body can move nicely on the chassis and not be bound up tight by the pins pushing it into the chassis. It all helps with a little bit of handling of the car. So notice I'm just doing this by hand, just cleaning up the inside of the holes like that. Here we go, all 4 pinholes cleaned out nicely with a 1.8mm drill in a little pin vise. Now we can remove the protective coating on the shell that protected it from overspray and other scratches, etc. So to do this I use a little bit of tape. I stick it to the outside, and then I can use this little bit of tape here to help me pull off that outer coating, because that can sometimes be really hard to do if you're not used to, if you haven't got any nails, etc. So using a little bit of tape is a good tip. Then we carefully peel that back, and we can reveal the final colour. Beautiful.